A Rabbinic Anthology, selected with an introduction by C.G. Montefiore and H.Loewe. Chapter 1. The Nature and Character of God and His Relations with Man. The guiding principle of selection for this Rabbinic Anthology has been to choose passages which 1. Go beyond or lie outside Old Testament teaching, or 2. Which illustrate and develop that teaching at its best. The religious and ethical teachings of the Old Testament are at various levels of excellence. Here it is proposed to illustrate only the higher or highest levels. Therefore, as is but right in an anthology, my purpose is to present flowers, not weeds. Amidst the weeds of Pharisaism are flowers, amidst the evangelic flowers are weeds. I cannot overcome my preference for the flowers. I am no gatherer of weeds. Abraham's Studies in Pharisaism and the Gospels, 2nd series, page 7. For just as the Old Testament contains weeds, so too does the rabbinic literature. These are neglected, yet it will be necessary to mention some weeds here and there, if only to set off the flowers more sharply. And besides the actual weeds, I shall have also occasionally to quote or allude to passages which cannot properly be called weeds, and which are certainly not flowers, but which are needed for the better understanding of the flowers, and in order not to give a false picture of the rabbinic religion as a whole. For though the main object of this book is to collect flowers, yet in presenting such a collection to the reader, care should be taken not to exaggerate or to give a false impression. The total literature of any religion, more especially when that literature is of enormous size, is far from being nothing more than an assemblage of gems. Again, in a rabbinic anthology, the reader must be prepared for oddities, quaintnesses, queer stories, differences of taste between the rabbis and ourselves. And yet these oddities may justly find a place in an anthology, so far as they are truly characteristic of rabbinic religion, or illustrate some fine and peculiar rabbinic teaching. They may indeed often illustrate that teaching far better than a brief copybook utterance. Hence, the limits of anthology have to be drawn fairly wide. We have also always to bear in mind that to the rabbis, the Old Testament was inspired and excellent from end to end. More especially was the Pentateuch regarded as the Word of God in the very fullest degree. Thus the lower levels of the Old Testament were in their eyes no less divine than the higher levels, and no inconsistencies could ultimately be admitted or allowed. How did the rabbis get over this basic trouble and dilemma? Did they explain the higher in the light of the lower, or the lower in the light of the higher? Did they drag down the second, or elevate the first? Or did they simply, without realizing the inconsistencies of the Old Testament, well, there's more inconsistencies in the Old Testament than Tanakh, but then again, there's more variations in Tanakh, and there's more versions of the Old Testament, are their own adopt and expand both high and low. Did they make the high yet higher and the low yet lower? The answer, I think, is that all these methods of treatment, all these varieties of teaching can be discovered. Illustrations can be found of them all, and it is probable that even in this anthology, indications of all of them will be included before the end. Like Dr. Cohen in his admirable book, Every Man's Talmud, I too will begin my anthology with passages about the nature of God and his relation to the world, to man and to Israel, It is hardly necessary to let any rabbinic quotations emphasize the Old Testament doctrine that there is only one God, but the following passage is noteworthy. Exodus R. Yitro 29:9 in regards to Isaiah 11. Oh, wait, no. Anyways, that's pointing at a quote within a quote. When God gave the law, no bird sang or flew, no ox bellowed, angels did not fly, the seraphim ceased from saying, Holy, holy. The sea was calm, no creature spoke. The world was silent and still, and the divine voice said, I am the Lord thy God. If you wonder at this, think of Elijah when he came to Mount Carmel and summoned all the priests of Baal and said to them, Cry aloud, for he is a God. God caused all the world to be still, and those above and those below were silent, and the world was, as it were, empty and void, as if no creature existed. As it says, there was no voice, nor any answer. 1 Kings 18, verses 27 and 29. For if anyone had spoken, the priests would have said, Baal has answered us. So at Sinai, God made the whole world silent, so that all the creatures should know that there is no God besides him. And so he spoke, I am the Lord thy God, and so too, in the days to come, he will say, I and I alone am he that comforts you. Isaiah 51:12. And let us remember that when it says Lord in a translation, that's usually a replacement rather than a translation, when it's referring to God. We can hardly go beyond the emphatic utterances of Isaiah or the Deuteronomic assertion 4:39. Know therefore this day, and lay it to thine heart, that the Lord, he is God in heaven above, and upon the earth beneath. There is none else, one God only, monotheism. But how about the divine unity? The actual verse of the Shema, which is not particularly stressed in the book of Deuteronomy, had by the time of the rabbis become the watchword of Judaism. Per book page 40, the word Shema or Shema means hear, and at the first word of the passage they're quoted and here alluded to. And what's that verse about don't trust HaKohanim? So the rabbis and Cohens. The growth of the importance of the Shema as a creed cannot be accurately traced. Its position by, say, 30 of the Common Era is assured by the stories in the Gospels. It had become a confession of faith, and as such had to be recited by every Jew twice a day. To the rabbis, the Shema, in its fuller meaning, included not only Deuteronomy 6, verses 4-9, but also the two passages Deuteronomy 11:13-21 and Numbers 15:37-47, which are always grouped with it in Orthodox prayer books. See note 77. And one of the things we need to look at is that Jesus, according to the Bible, said the primary commandment is that. So this thing where he's like a second God or something like this, no, he would have understood what he was saying. The full repetition of the Shema meant the repetition of all three passages, the reciting of the first section, and thus to acknowledge the one God was called to take upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Therefore it says in the Mishnah, to bear 2 is from Bear 2:2. R. Joshua B. Karcha said, "Why does the section, Hear, O Israel, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, proceed, and it shall come to pass if ye shall hearken, Deuteronomy 11:13-21, so that a man shall first receive upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and afterwards receive upon himself the yoke of the commandments." See also notes 1 and 2. Selection 3, Deuteronomy Wa et Chanan 2:31. R. Judah said in the name of Rob, "He who has to say the Shema while he is out walking must stand still and receive the kingdom of heaven. And what is the kingdom of heaven? The Lord our God, the Lord is one." Selection 4, Deuteronomy R. Wa et Chanan 2:36. The rabbis say that when Moses went up to God, he heard the angels of the service say to God, "Blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever." And he brought this utterance down to the Israelites. See the last line in small type on Prayer Book, page 40. Why do the Israelites not say it out loud? R. Assi said, "The matter is like as if a man stole a jewel from the king's palace and gave it to his wife, and said to her, 'Do not deck yourself with it publicly, but only within the house.' But on the Day of Atonement, when the Israelites are as guiltless as the angels of the service, they say out loud, 'Blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forevermore.'" And I shared another prayer book. It is still the custom in Orthodox synagogues to say the words, blessed, etc., more or less quietly after the recitation of the opening verse of the Shema, but on the Day of Atonement, in the morning and evening services, it is said aloud by the congregation. The above passage refers to this custom. See the citation number 290. This doxology is the response to the first verse of the Shema, prayer book page 40, and was uttered in the temple on the Day of Atonement when the high priest pronounced the ineffable name. V. Aptowitzer, in an interesting article in the Monteschrift F. Gest U. Wis D. Jude, volume 73, heft 3/4 for March and April. Heft 3 and 4 for March to April 1929, page 93, explains the formula as arising from various scriptural doxologies. For example, Psalm 72, verses 18 and 19, Nehemiah 9, verse 5, Psalm 147:20, and as having been introduced in public worship as a protest against Hasmonean assumption of kingship and the Sadducean denial of the future life. This introduction he places in the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. The article deserves careful study. It deals also with the Shema. See selection 693. H.L. Is it Howard? What's this? Herbert. Oh. Selection 5. Jacob, on his deathbed, wanted to reveal to his sons the end of days, i.e., when the Messiah would come. Then the Shekinah departed from him. Then he said, perhaps there is a blemish in my household, as Ishmael was to Abraham, and as Esau was to Isaac. Then his sons said to him, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Even as in your heart there is only one, so in our heart there is only one. Then Jacob said, blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. Note 78, and that was from PES 56A. Selection 6, Deuteronomy R. Wa Etchanan 235. See also selection 22. Since when have the Israelites had the privilege to recite the Shema? From the day when Jacob was on his deathbed, he summoned the tribes and said to them, when I am removed from the world, perhaps you will worship another god. The Quran mentions something like that. That he says, what will you worship after me? After I'm gone. So it is written, and Jacob called his sons and said, gather yourselves together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. Genesis 49, verse 1 and 2. For Jacob said to them, is Israel your father? And they said, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he said softly, blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. R.Levi said, what do the Israelites say now? Hear, Israel, our father. The word which thou didst command us is still abidingly with us. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Thanan 235, chapter 22. What the exact meaning of the Shema may have been to the original writer is, like its right translation, extremely doubtful. Because we know that some of these texts have changed language and stuff. And there's certainly language periods of what they call biblical Hebrew too. And modern Hebrew is about as different as French and English. See Abraham's companion, page page LI, and RV, the translation, and AV and RV, the text. Hear, Israel, Yahweh, our God is one Yahweh, is probably the more correct rendering. Well, there was the ancient Egyptian formulas that the Tetragrammaton was based upon, ending in 2 H's, meaning eternity. What did it mean to the rabbis? Did it mean more than that there was only one God? The unity doctrine is sometimes used in a way which to us may seem hardly appropriate. Selection 7. Tunch B. Wayera 49a. But he is in one, and who can turn him? And what does his soul desires, even that he does? Job 23:13. This is the literal translation, but see number 8. Our papas explained this verse, seeing that he is unique in the universe, and none can restrain him. Therefore, whatsoever he seeks, that he does. Akaba said to him, enough, papas, not thus is the true exposition, but all that he does is done by justice. The procedure in the heavenly court is governed by law, as in an earthly court. Mercy and justice are equated on either side. What then is the meaning of since he is one? It is that because God is unique in the universe, he knows the character of every single creature and their minds. Tanbi 49a. There is a second version of the same story, which runs thus: selection 8, Tanchbi, Shemot 4b. See also selection 139 and 368. But he is in one mind, and who can turn him and what his soul desires, even that he does. Job 23:13. Arpapos thus expounded the verse, since he is alone in the world, and none can withstand him, therefore whatsoever he seeks to do, that he does. Akaba said to him, it is enough, Pappos. Not so do we expound the verse. There is judgment above just as there is below. Daniel 4:17. There, too, they plead with arguments of law, and all's done in justice. See, Daniel 10:21. God himself deals justice. He says, how fares the suit of such a one? And they answer, so it fell out, and God agrees with the verdict. This you learn from Micaiah, who said, I saw the Lord seated on his throne, and all the host of heaven on his right and left. 1 Kings 22:19. Is there a physical right and left in heaven? Right, therefore, means inclining to right or acquitting, and left must mean inclining to the left or condemnation. All then is done in justice. And what does Job mean? It means that since God is alone in the world, he knows the minds of his creatures. See also note 12. Shemot 4b. Did God's unity also mean to the rabbis that this only God was also in his nature, in his essence one? I think it did, yet it can hardly be said that the rabbis touch upon the more metaphysical aspects of the divine unity. The rabbis were no theologians. See 692 and 1641 of the selections. They had no training in philosophy. What they are really concerned to emphasize is that God's nature is ever the same. His deeds may vary, but he does not change. It is the whole God and the same God who expresses himself in different ways according to different requirements and occasions, or again, it is we who perceive different aspects, or as we say, different attributes of God. But it is the same God and the whole God, and the one God who acts in many diverse ways, yet ever remains changeless, and constant and the same. And one may look at the 112th chapter of the Quran to get more of a clarity, or Surah 6, 103. But one of the things that needed to be done in the Talmudic period is to make clear that they understood that some of these things weren't literally, or some of these things were in terms of something beyond human. But that wasn't as explicitly stated in the Tanakh. But it was understood that way.